The text message arrived without ceremony, a sterile blue bubble on a screen that felt miles away. It was from a number I knew belonged to my son, but the words themselves felt like they had been typed by a stranger's thumbs. There was no warmth, no preamble, just a notification slipped under the door of my life. The subject, had it been an email, would have read, "Thanksgiving Logistics." I stared at the screen, the light illuminating the fine lines around my eyes in the dim living room, and felt a familiar, quiet tightening in my chest. It was the specific ache of being demoted from a character in the story to a footnote. For a woman who once spent 48 sleepless hours meticulously crafting a scale model of the solar system for a fourth-grade science project, who had learned to bake gluten-free bread from scratch just to see him smile, this digital summons felt like a shard of glass in my throat. I wonder if you've ever felt that. A message so brief it could fit on a postage stamp, yet it carries the weight of a dozen unspoken goodbyes. The slow, grinding realization that the lock has been changed on a door you helped build. The message simply said, "Dinner is at our place on Thursday, around 4. Sarah is handling everything. Hope you can make it." Not from Liam. The message was from Liam's phone, but the cadence, the efficiency, the faint perfume of obligation, that was all Serafina, his wife. The word hope was the final, delicate twist of the knife. Hope, as if my attendance was a matter of casual convenience, as if my presence was optional, as if I were optional. My weekly calls with Liam had long ago withered into monthly texts, and now even those felt like automated payment reminders, a life's worth of connection dwindling into a handful of pixels. I sat with the phone in my hand, the screen's glow the only light in the room, and I watched the rain begin to streak down the window pane, blurring the world outside. The skeletal branches of the old cedar tree clawed at the gray sky, surrendering to the relentless November wind. After a long moment, I typed back a reply, my fingers moving with a deliberate slowness, as if the letters were made of something fragile. "Thank you. I will be there." I didn't ask what I could bring. I didn't offer to come early to help peel potatoes or set the table. I had learned, through a series of gently administered lessons, where the new boundaries were drawn. They were invisible fences, electrified with unspoken rules, and I was done stumbling into them in a foolish attempt to be helpful. I set the phone down and leaned back, the worn leather of my armchair sighing under my weight. I allowed myself, just for a second, to imagine Liam calling me himself. To hear his voice say, "Mom, it wouldn't be Thanksgiving without you." But that kind of thinking was a dangerous indulgence, a way of picking at old wounds until they bled anew. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed the hour, its deep tones echoing in the stillness. My gaze drifted to a sea chest in the corner, a relic from my father, its brass fittings dull with age. Inside, tucked away in velvet cloth, were the heirlooms I'd meant to pass down. I hadn't looked at them in years. The invitation was a sliver of ice, but I was going. Because sometimes, when a door is held open just a crack, you still feel compelled to slip through, holding on to the foolish, desperate hope that the air inside might be warmer than the Arctic draft that beckoned you in. I decided against bringing food. My offerings of rosemary-infused turkey and pumpkin chiffon pie had in recent years been met with polite, strained smiles and the quiet explanation that Serafina was adhering to a very specific curated menu. Instead, I went to the old workshop behind my cottage, the scent of cedar shavings and sea salt clinging to the air. My hands, though softened by age, still remembered the feel of the wood. I had spent my life as a marine biologist, studying the silent, resilient life beneath the waves, and I knew how to be patient. I found the small, unadorned box I had carved from a piece of driftwood years ago. The wood was smooth, silvered by the sun and salt. Inside, I placed a single object, a small brass compass that had belonged to my own father, a sailor who had charted his course by the stars. It was the compass he had given Liam on his 10th birthday, teaching him how to find true north. I wondered if he even remembered. With the compass, I tucked a letter, written on thick, cream-colored stationery I'd been saving for something important. The words didn't come easily. They weren't accusations or pleas. They were a map. "I hope this still points the way home," I wrote. Not to a place, but to a feeling. I miss the boy who wasn't afraid of getting lost because he always knew the way back to himself. I still believe he's in there. The gift wasn't grand. It was a quiet thing, a whisper against the coming cacophony of the holiday. But it held the weight of 30 years of starlit nights, of scraped knees and bedtime stories, of the silent, fervent prayers I had offered up to the uncaring sea whenever his own small boat had drifted too far from shore. I wrapped the box in simple brown paper, tied it with twine, and set it by the door. I would not arrive empty-handed. I would arrive holding a piece of a story they seemed determined to forget, a reminder of who I was, not just Liam's mother, but the keeper of his compass, the one who had first taught him how to read the tides. The ferry ride to the island was choppy, the sky a bruised purple gray. A thick mist clung to the water, obscuring the familiar shoreline and turning the other islands into ghostly silhouettes. I parked my car on the slick pavement and let the engine die. Their house, a modern structure of glass and steel that always seemed to be resisting the wild landscape around it, was aglow with warm, inviting light. Laughter spilled out, muffled by the sound of the wind and rain, carried on the scent of roasting turkey and pine. It was a perfect portrait of familial bliss, a scene from a catalog, a scene I was about to walk into. I pulled the gift from the passenger seat, shielding it from the rain with my coat. My hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from the raw, exposed nerve of hope. The walk up the bluestone path felt impossibly long. Each step was a negotiation with my own pride. I passed the meticulously landscaped garden, a space I had helped design and plant when they first moved in, back when my input was still considered a gift, rather than an intrusion. I reached the front door and pressed the sleek, backlit doorbell. A pleasant, digital chime echoed from within, followed by a surge of laughter. I waited. The rain dripped from the eaves, soaking the collar of my coat. No one came. I could see shadows moving behind the frosted glass, figures passing back and forth, but the door remained closed. I pressed the bell again, a little longer this time. Still nothing. The cold began to seep through my shoes, a damp, insidious chill that worked its way into my bones. 10 minutes crawled by. A car passed on the lane, its headlights cutting through the gloom, and the driver, a neighbor I barely knew, gave a friendly wave. I tried to smile back, but my lips felt frozen. How do you explain standing on a doorstep unwelcomed, at a party you were invited to? There is no graceful way to say, "I exist, but I have not been acknowledged." Just as a profound, soul-deep weariness began to set in, I saw a flicker of movement through the glass. A shape paused, turned, then disappeared. The sound of the deadbolt sliding back was shockingly loud. The door opened, and there was Liam. He wasn't smiling. His face was a carefully blank canvas, his eyes holding a familiar mixture of apology and resignation. "Mom," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a greeting. It was an identification. He stepped aside, a silent, half-hearted invitation. He didn't reach for my gift. Inside, the heat and noise were a physical blow. The air was thick with the smells of wealth and comfort, roasting spices, expensive perfume, damp wool. The living room was crowded with strangers whose laughter was loud and effortless. Serafina emerged from the throng, a vision in cashmere and expertly applied lipstick. She looked at me, and her smile was a masterpiece of social engineering. It was flawless, bright, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Oh, Elara, we were beginning to worry," she said, her voice a silken thread of polite accusation. "We got so caught up in everything." She didn't take my gift, either. She gestured vaguely towards a heaping pile of coats on a bench. "Just put your things anywhere." Then she turned, already drawn back into a conversation with a woman dripping in gold jewelry. I found a space for my wet coat and left the small, paper-wrapped box on the edge of a console table, where it sat looking small and out of place. The dining room was a spectacle of polished silver and crystal. 12 people were seated around a massive oak table. At the far end, tucked awkwardly into a corner by the kitchen doorway, was a single folding chair. My chair. I knew it without asking. I slid into it, my knees brushing against a potted fiddle leaf fig. No one introduced me. The woman to my right gave me a brief, curious glance before turning back to her conversation about a ski trip to Aspen. Liam was seated halfway down the table next to Serafina's father. He caught my eye once, gave a tight, almost imperceptible nod, and then looked away, his attention immediately captured by a story being told across from him. The food was served. It was exquisite, a culinary magazine brought to life. Serafina moved around the table with the practiced grace of a seasoned hostess, refilling wine glasses, laughing at jokes, a radiant sun at the center of her own universe. I ate in silence, the taste of ashes in my mouth. When dessert was served, a deconstructed pumpkin tart with candied ginger, Serafina's aunt asked where she had found the stunning hand-blown water glasses. "Oh, these were a wedding gift," Serafina announced to the table. "From Liam's Aunt Catherine. I had bought them that set. I had driven 200 miles to a small artisan studio in Oregon to pick them out myself." I swallowed a mouthful of coffee and felt the heat of it burn all the way down. I had been let into the house, but I had not been welcomed. My contributions had not been forgotten. They had been reassigned. After dinner, as the adults lingered with coffee and liqueurs, the polite erasure continued. The conversation drifted to the house itself, its architecture, its clean lines. "We were so lucky to start with a blank canvas," Serafina said, her eyes sweeping the room. "No inherited clutter, no ghosts from the past, just our own story." Liam said nothing, just swirled the brandy in his glass. The words weren't directed at me, but they landed like stones. I watched Liam across the room. I saw the familiar way he ran a hand through his hair when he was stressed, a gesture he'd had since he was a boy. But the easy smile, the open heart I remembered, had been replaced by a carefully constructed facade of placid contentment. He was a man living in a beautiful house that was not his own, married to a woman who was rewriting his history. One polite, brutal sentence at a time. Serafina's 7-year-old niece, a girl with bright, inquisitive eyes, approached my chair. She stared at me for a long moment, head tilted. Then she turned to her mother and asked, in a whisper loud enough for half the table to hear, "Is she the lady who comes to water the plants?" A few people chuckled uncomfortably. Serafina laughed, a tinkling sound like breaking glass. "Oh, honey, no," she said, but she didn't correct her. She didn't say, "This is your grandmother." She said nothing more, letting the child's innocent cruelty hang in the air. Liam didn't look at me. I sat perfectly still, a ghost at the feast. I had been invited but not seen. I was present, but I was not there. Later, as people began to leave, I saw my gift, still on the console table. Someone had placed a half-empty cocktail glass on it, leaving a wet ring on the brown paper. I walked over, picked it up, and held it in my hands. The contents felt heavy. I didn't offer it again. I quietly tucked it into my purse, a secret I would take back home with me. When only a few guests remained, I found myself adrift in the hallway, uncertain of the protocol. Was I expected to leave? To stay? Liam and Serafina were in the kitchen, their backs to me, murmuring about the logistics of tomorrow. No one offered me the guest room. No one said a word. The house had a small den off the living room, a space for the children. Inside was a low, lumpy sofa bed, covered in a fleece blanket patterned with cartoon rockets. I had seen it once before. With a quiet resignation that felt as heavy as stone, I walked in, took off my shoes, and lay down, pulling the thin blanket over me. There was no pillow. I folded my coat and tucked it under my head. Through the open door, I could see the gallery wall in the main hallway. It was filled with professionally shot photographs. Liam and Serafina on a beach in Bali, their daughter's ballet recital, a laughing group shot from a ski trip. All new memories, all polished and perfect. My history, our history, had been curated out of existence. There were no baby pictures, no awkward school photos, no image of the day I taught him to ride his bike in our old, cracked driveway. I was the forgotten foundation of a house that now stood on its own, pretending it had been built on air. I closed my eyes, the springs of the sofa digging into my back. I thought about the years I'd worked double shifts as a research assistant to pay for his college applications, coming home long after dark to find him asleep with his head on a textbook. It never felt like a sacrifice then. It felt like building something. Now, in this house my own quiet generosity had helped secure. I was an afterthought, relegated to a child's sofa. No one had even said goodnight. I listened to the hum of the expensive refrigerator and the sigh of the heating system, and for the first time, I didn't feel sadness. I felt a cold, hard clarity blooming in the darkness. It had taken a lifetime to build my family, and one evening to realize I had been architecting my own obsolescence. Morning arrived as a pale, watery light filtering through the den's windows. I rose stiffly, my body aching from the cramped night. The house was quiet, but for the low murmur of voices from the kitchen. I folded the rocket ship blanket with meticulous care and walked into the hallway. Liam was at the counter, phone pressed to his ear, nodding. Serafina stood beside him, already dressed in yoga attire, scrolling through her own device. She looked up as I approached, her expression one of mild surprise, as if she had forgotten I was there. "Ilara," she began, her voice smooth and practiced. "Liam and I were just talking. We've been thinking about you." Liam ended his call and turned to me, his face arranged in an expression of gentle concern. "Mom, there's a wonderful community we saw, a place for active seniors. It's on the mainland, beautiful grounds, private cottages. We thought it would be perfect for you. Give you your own space. Independence." Serafina nodded in agreement. "It's about making sure you're comfortable, that you have peace and security." The words were polished stones, smooth and hard and cold. They weren't asking me. They were informing me of their solution. I had become a problem to be solved, a piece to be moved off the board. I was no longer a part of their home, not even a ghost in the corner. I was an object to be placed in a tasteful, appropriate box where they would no longer have to think about me. A slow, calm smile spread across my face. It was a real smile, and it seemed to startle them. "Thank you for your concern," I said, my voice even and clear. "I will certainly give it some thought." Liam's shoulders relaxed in relief. Serafina had already returned her attention to her phone. No one asked if I wanted coffee. No one asked how I had slept. I retrieved my coat, its dampness a lingering memory of my vigil on their porch, and walked to the door. As I left, the small, paper-wrapped box still in my purse, I did not look back. The drive home was a blur of gray water and grayer sky. But inside my car, the world felt sharp and clear. Back in my own small cottage, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt powerful. It felt like mine. I went to the old sea chest in the corner and pulled out a thick, worn folder. The deed to their house, still in my name. The trust fund I had established for their daughter's education, with me as the sole administrator. the automatic payment authorizations for their mortgage and utilities, which I had set up years ago as a quiet safety net and never bothered to cancel. I sat at my kitchen table, the compass from my father sitting beside the folder, its needle pointing true north. I picked up the phone. My first call was to my lawyer. My second was to my financial advisor. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of correction, a realignment. The tide had been going out for a very long time, and I was finally turning to face the shore. 2 days later, Liam called. His voice was tight, strained. He didn't ask directly. He said there seemed to be a clerical error with their mortgage payment. He wondered if I knew anything about it. Yes, I said calmly. I made some changes. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Changes? Mom, what's going on? I was just taking your advice, Liam, I replied, my voice steady. You said it was time for me to have my own space, my own independence. I realized you were right. It's time for you to have yours too. He started to speak, a confused, frustrated sound, but I continued. The house is being placed into a charitable trust to provide housing subsidies for retired marine scientists. The educational fund is being repurposed for scholarships for young women entering the field. All the accounts are being settled. I thought about the retirement community, but I've decided to stay here. I'm no longer interested in being placed anywhere. I could hear his sharp intake of breath. He didn't understand. Not the years of quiet hurt, not the slow erasure, not the profound disrespect. He only understood the sudden, inconvenient consequences. This wasn't a punishment meant to bring him back. It was a boundary meant to save myself. I had spent a lifetime pouring my love and resources into a vessel that had become a sieve. Now, I was redirecting that river, not to hurt him, but to finally water my own garden. Outside, the rain had stopped. A sliver of pale sun broke through the clouds, glinting off the choppy surface of the Sound. The world was quiet, but it was no longer lonely. It was my own. A week after the phone call, there was a knock on my door. It was gentle, hesitant. I found Liam standing on my porch, alone. He held a small, store-bought peace lily. He looked tired, older. He didn't apologize, not in words, but he asked if he could come in. I let him. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the clock. He finally told me that Serafina had been furious, that their life had been thrown into chaos. He spoke of mortgages and finances, the practical wreckage of their situation. I just listened. I don't understand why you did it, he finally said, his voice quiet. I got up and retrieved the small, paper-wrapped box from my purse. I placed it on the table between us. He looked at it, then slowly unwrapped it. He opened the driftwood box and stared at the brass compass nestled inside. He picked it up, his thumb tracing its worn edges. He read the note. Being needed is not the same as being seen, Liam, I said softly. I spent 30 years making sure you were seen. I just wish, somewhere along the way, you had learned to do the same for me. He didn't reply. He couldn't. Because an apology would require an understanding he did not possess. He left an hour later. The embrace I had once longed for never came, and I found I did not need it. Some chasms are too wide to be crossed by a bridge of words. The next day, my neighbor from across the cove, Anya, stopped by with a thermos of hot tea. She was part of a group of women on the island, retired teachers, artists, doctors, widows. They called themselves the Keepers of the Coast. They met weekly, not to complain, but to build. They maintained the island's hiking trails, volunteered at the small library, and watched over each other's cottages in the winter storms. They were quiet pillars, holding up their small world, She invited me to join them. For the first time in a long time, I said yes, without hesitation. I was not being asked to contribute, or to serve, or to fill a need. I was being invited to belong. That evening, I sat on my porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the last light fade from the sky. The peace I felt was not the passive quiet of resignation, but the active, resonant peace of self-reclamation. Love, I now understood, is not meant to be a slow act of self-immolation. It is meant to be a light. For years I had been a lantern for my family, and in their carelessness, they had let my oil run dry. But they forgot one thing. I was the one who knew how to find the light. And now I was finally turning it back on, not for them, but for myself. The flame was small, but it was steady, and in the growing dark, it was more than enough.